For those of you who are just joining us, we are here today with two incredible folks that I've had the pleasure of getting to know during COVID, one of the silver linings. We are here with Dr. Sanchita Saxena, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for South Asian Studies at UC Berkeley, and Dr. Mark Anner, who is a Professor of Labor and Employment Relations, as well as Political Science Director for the Center of Global Worker Rights at Penn State. I was personally just very struck by Dr. Anna and Dr. Saxena's research and how looking at what is happening to garment workers as well as the impact of brand behavior and their purchasing practices, how that was really exasperating the inequities within the global supply chain. And it literally was putting the two pieces of research really painted the picture in such a holistic way that I told them, you have to come to our February community call and drop some knowledge. So we are going to go ahead and get started. I really wanted to start, Mark and Sanchita, on a personal front. So much of our community brings their whole selves to these calls. And so I was just wondering, from your personal journey, what led you to focus on the garment industry in particular? And when you look at how the industry has changed over the last decade, what comes to mind? And ladies first, maybe we'll start with Sanchita.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Aisha. Thank you for having me, and welcome to all of you. It's wonderful to see so many of you here this morning for us, but I think it's, many time zones for all of you. So thank you. It's really an honor to be here. And of course, with Professor Anner. Very briefly, I started working and thinking about this industry, I guess about 15 years ago. I can almost think of the actual date because it was right before the MFA, the multi-fiber arrangement. You may all know about that. I won't go into details, but it was basically the system of quotas that was kind of governing the trade of garments and textiles. That was in place for 40 years, and that was going to expire in 2005. So in 2004, this was before I joined Berkeley, I was at the Asia Foundation, and we were saying, oh, we have to do some programs, all these smaller countries, so excluding China and India, but really thinking of these smaller Asian countries, they are just going to completely become devastated. There's going to be social upheaval. All these women are going to lose their jobs. Like, what's going to happen? So that's how I got kind of interested and into thinking about this sector. But to be very honest, I never thought 15, 16 years later, I'd still be working on it. This is how it happens often in life. Just some key highlights, what I started looking at, I did more comparative work, looking at Bangladesh, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, those three countries. I was really more interested in what was happening in those countries in terms of how the sector was changing post MFA, post the expiration of these quotas, particularly also the activism that we were seeing, especially among women. That was really of interest to me. When I think one of the things, and I think this is for probably many of you, Rana Plaza was really a significant devastating event that took place. And I think any of us who followed the sector, or anyone, human beings in general, I think would have found this horrific. But that actually, my interest changed slightly in 2013. And I started looking at the industry more from the side of the business side. So I hadn't looked at that before. So I started looking at the broader issues around global supply chains and it's so complicated. What does this even mean? And how do businesses interact? What is their, how are they accountable or not? What are their decisions? So I started looking at the industry kind of from the other angle, I suppose. So that was really a kind of a turning point for me.
Amazing. And Mark, we have been such colleagues during the PayUp fight in some ways and the campaigning, but you've had such an illustrious and deep career when it comes to this industry. Just curious, what brought you and personally motivated you to be going down this path of research? And as you look at, 10 years, 15 years, how has the industry really changed?
Wow, two great questions, but also let me start by thanking you, Aisha, for the invitation and for all your amazing work, and for all of you on this call. I know you've been working so hard with the PayUp campaign and getting out there and getting the word out, and you had an impact. You changed workers' lives. I estimate we got about well, you should 22 billion paid up. I mean, how many workers' lives have been impacted by your work? So thank you. Yeah, so I'll date myself age-wise. I I was living in Boston, studied in Boston, did union organizing in Boston, and I was invited by unionists in El Salvador if I could go, bilingual, I speak Spanish, if I could go to El Salvador to work around worker rights issues. They needed someone who was bilingual to document and get the word out. So in 1988, I moved to El Salvador. And I became very close friends with the union leader there, Febe Velasquez, who was a garment worker. And it was during the Civil War. It was a very dangerous time. And I learned a lot about the industry from her. And she was killed. And this had a very big impact on me, a very close friend. I was with her when she was killed. I ended up leaving the country for a bit. It got so bad with the Civil War. But then I went back soon afterwards. 1991, and the country was transitioning from war to peace. And the model of development post-war was to go all in on export processing zones. The country was going to transition from war to peace by building like these mushrooming export processing zones from one corner of the country to the next. And a lot of us, we didn't even know back then. They used the word maquila, these zonas libres, all these different terms they had. But as I put it, the mushroom of the zones corresponded with the mushroom of worker rights abuses, things that those of us that specialized had never heard of. I mean, 72-hour work weeks, sexual harassment on the scale intensity. We had never thought of this before. And so I began documenting this. I got pulled into a campaign involving the Gap, which was one of the very first campaigns in the early 90s, and that was eventually successful. So many people worked on that, and for the first time ever, these fired unionists got their jobs back with their union intact. They returned to work. And I just I visited my first factory going back in 1988, and I just remember those conditions that I first saw then really impacted me. I eventually leave El Salvador, late 90s. I go to Cornell and I decide this is going to be a big part of my dissertation research. And I've been researching it ever since, but I really started with very, very strong, deep activist roots. So I never wanted to lose that connection. Like Sanchita, I've got increasingly into the looking at the business side of this. To understand the business side, I realized I had to get that down to figure out what was going on with the worker rights abuses. And I eventually get very focused in on what starts as the pricing squeeze, but there were so many other purchasing practices that I realized were impacting the sector. I began studying those as well. As far as what's changed, it's a great question. It's a difficult question. I ask that myself all the time. Some things haven't, a lot of the conditions we see, they haven't changed much. One really big change, though, you go back all those years. In the early years, the brands and the retailers just said, this isn't our problem. Basically, Nike, the others were saying, we outsource this fair and square. Why are you coming to us? Those are independent factories. They have their own legal recognition. They're in El Salvador, Honduras. If there's a problem, the government there should deal with it. This is outsourcing. That's why you do outsourcing, right? It's not our factory. And that changed through a lot of campaignings. The brands know you can't get away with that. If they've got product there and they're making profit off those products, they've got a shared responsibility. That's an enormous change. The battle is, how do you make sure that shared responsibility has lasting impacts? And that's where we shifted from these voluntary to these binding agreements. Like Sanchita mentioned, the importance of Rana Plaza, and I think the importance of what happened afterwards, the accord and the binding agreement that brought on a whole new model of doing things. So there are important achievements. On the flip side, you look at some of the graphs we've done on the price squeeze, it's gotten worse and worse for the reasons Sanchita said. The turning point is really when that controlled trade in garments, the multi-fiber arrangement phases out and China and Vietnam comes on. And then you just see this all out squeeze on price. And that trickles down through a squeeze on wages, a squeeze on working time, a squeeze on work intensity, a squeeze on building safety. Because if you're squeezed on price, you're going to get pushed into unsafe buildings and you end up with Rana Plaza. And all this is already in place when then COVID happens, and you just see just how devastating the impact was on workers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the institutional memory here is so important, which both of you bring. And, talking about the multi-fiber arrangement and that set to expire, I remember working on the inside of brands at that point when, they were writing up things around responsible transitions because, oh, once China and Vietnam comes, we knew that the Latin American countries were going to be decimated from a trade standpoint. But the biggest problem was that all of these agreements, arrangements were voluntary, right? And that's what I think for people to really understand, that as we moved away from unionization, as we moved away from collective bargaining, as we moved away from binding agreements with these brands, their purchasing practices is exactly what gave us Rana Plaza. And then here we are at the pandemic where, we come back to the purchasing practices. So starting with you, Mark, and jumping right to the pandemic, your research was so pivotal in terms of us as campaigners understanding order cancellations. So paint a picture for us, end of February, March, what you were starting to see. But here we are 10 months later in the pandemic, and what are you seeing in terms of brand behavior and purchasing practices?
Yeah, great questions. I try to be quick on this. Jump in if I'm going rambling, but quickly, it was horrific what we saw in March, and I think the story is pretty well known now. The pandemic, really hits Europe, U.S., major consumer markets. Shutdowns happen, and buyers and brands, in a sense, panic, but knew their power in the supply chain. And they just massively put out email notices, calls, or whatever, saying, force majeure, act of God, we're not paying. Orders are canceled. And the things we know now, these are orders where the suppliers have to front all the money. They have to front the money to buy the fabric, the buttons, the zippers. They're paying the workers, right? They're paying their own building rent. All that is fronted. They're waiting, the average probably at the time, 30 to 60 days later to get paid. So all that is on their dime, and they're canceled without being paid. Right? And you have the figures on that 91% canceled without paying for in-production orders. It was absolutely devastating. And then what the research shows, we went from the cancellations in Bangladesh at 3-point-something billion, extrapolated upward at 40 billion was canceled in a remarkably short period of time, right? So keep in mind, but Bangladesh is, that's more than the entire exports from Bangladesh, it's worldwide. And the impact on workers was devastating. Workers were sent home without furlough pay. They were sent home without severance pay. These are workers who weren't getting a living wage. They not only had no savings, they owed money at the neighborhood store and so on. So those dismissals turned very quickly into food insecurity, and eventually, turns into an increase in malnutrition among garment workers and their families. So that was then. What's going on, sort of post that original crisis, so into the summer of 2020 and to this day, the industry is facing what I call a triple squeeze. The first is the reduction in order volume. We know stores are still shut. Consumers are still not buying as much. People are still hurting in terms of their disposable income. So there's less demand. So the orders are going down. What the brands and the retailers are doing, they don't want to place those large orders because they don't want us to jump on them and call them out and pay up and so on. So they're doing short orders, quick delivery, but it's nowhere near the volume you would normally have at this time of year. So that's the first squeeze, dramatic reduction in order volume. The second squeeze, and I should say with that first squeeze, it's understandable. If consumers aren't buying the product, we can't demand, no, place the same order volume that you did last year. We know it's not being purchased. But the second squeeze, I think, is unforgivable. It's a squeeze on price. And here they're saying, you suppliers are desperate. You all want orders. There's an abundance of suppliers, but we need less. It's a buyer's market, literally in the supply chain, a buyer's market. We'll play one supplier off against another. We're coming down by 12, 13%. And if that's not good for you, we've got 10 suppliers lined up who will take it at the lower price point. So the second squeeze is on price, and we're seeing it in the data. 12 to 13% reduction. Same product from 2019 to 2020. So that's the second. And the third squeeze is dramatic delayment on payments. I mentioned they were paying 30, 60, 90 days out. They're now paying 60, 90, 120, even 180 days out. So the suppliers don't know which way to turn. They're getting less orders. The orders they do get are coming in at a less price. They're making those orders at this lower price, and then they're waiting months and months to get paid, and they need that cash to start the next order. It's really a horrific situation, and all this, as I said, is playing out most harshly on the workers at the bottom of the supply chain, who are either they're fired and they're facing malnutrition, they have dramatically reduced hours, and the wages before weren't enough to pay the bills. If you're now at halftime, you certainly can't pay the bills, or they're being fired and rehired as contingent workers because the factories don't know what kind of volume they'll have. So they've lost their permanent contracts. So this is, I think, if I could, best I could put quickly, that
No, I mean, you
situation
always
then and now, yeah.
describe it so eloquently, this sort of triple threat that's facing workers. And really, you say 12%. We know an average factory is barely profitable at 10%. So if you're squeezing price at 12 to 14%, you're essentially asking them to make product for free. And so, Sanchita, you often talk about, well, the way global supply chains are even set up, it's exactly detrimental to working conditions. They're set up to squeeze workers to begin with. So how do you, knowing that you've been really looking at worker surveys and thinking about this piece of the puzzle, think about how COVID has exacerbated these concerns?
Yeah, so I often say that, the very nature of global supply chains, so the particular characteristics that make them successful, lack of accountability, lack of transparency, hyper flexibility, unequal power relations, these are the characteristics that inherently make global supply chains work the way they are supposed to. But they are, of course, inherently at odds with good labor rights, good human rights. I mean, they're just completely incompatible. So I think what that means is when we have to realize that there's very little incentive for global retailers to actually change that model. I mean, it's the incentive is there for them to keep things intact, because as Mark was saying, I mean, the sort of the power discrepancy is very much highlighted. What I learned actually under COVID, so of course, I think COVID was especially egregious. It all kind of came to head, and it was very dramatic, the kinds of order cancellations and the drop in price. But apparently, I mean, I've had brands tell me this, and then talking to various suppliers, this is not really new. It's shocking now because it all came together, but it's actually very common practice for suppliers to produce all their goods, and for brands at some point to say, I don't think we actually need those. And I was really surprised because I didn't know it, into such detail. Brands have told me that this is not so shocking. It, of course, the impact of under COVID is much greater because it all happened at once. So, I mean, that tells you that on a whim, literally, like, oh, I just don't like that cut or that style or whatever, sorry, you produced it, but we're not going to take it. Or as Mark said, the other aspect of sort of delaying. Well, okay, we're going to delay 60, 90, this is under normal circumstances. This is actually acceptable. So, all that to say, I mean, I think what COVID has really demonstrated, it's exacerbated, and it really put a spotlight on the practices that have existed, for the last, many, many decades. We just don't, generally the public doesn't know it to this extent because it doesn't receive that kind of attention. And, suppliers really, really struggle in all these countries. I mean, they're sort of facing that issue constantly. Now with COVID, of course, we know, how detrimental it was for workers. And I mentioned Aisha at the beginning, and I'm happy to share the results of a survey we did in Bangladesh with more than 1,000 workers in the summer, just to get really just baseline understanding about how they were faring under COVID. And we have all the kind of data around what the drop in wages meant, how that impacted nutrition, you know, physical health, mental health, um, you know, lack of savings, you know, a lot of really, really critical areas that they just, you know, they suffered greatly. And unfortunately now, even, you know, I was talking to some labor leaders in Bangladesh, kind of as a follow-up to try to find out, you know, what the situation is. Things, you know, there's sort of the immediate things that are still, you know, there are a lot of workers suffering in terms of just, you know, for example, they gave the example with very egregious, many pregnant workers were laid off earlier on so that they wouldn't have to be paid maternity benefits. I mean, just really, really just upsetting, you know, to hear things like that. So a lot of women in particular are suffering just the day to day, you know, sort of nutrition, money. They need COVID tests. They need basic health care, you know, things like that. I mean, there is definitely an immediate need for those kind of things for workers.
And Sanchita, I wanted to, you know, go down this path a little bit more with you. You know, we are unabashedly a for women, by women movement. I often like to talk about we as a generation of women, whether, you know, we have models on this call, we have people within the fashion industry, we have customers, we are what keeps this industry profitable. And the people who power this industry on the other end also happen to be women. And when you were showing me your monthly wage chart, one of the things that I was really struck by was how you see a dip in wages, but the dip that you see and the decline that you see is more for sewers, which often are the people sitting on the factory floor, which means that these bad purchasing practices have disproportionately impacted women, you know, whether it means in terms of wages, whether it means pregnant women being targeted. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how this really is a crisis from a gender lens standpoint as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we see this data very, very clearly. And again, I'm happy to share the research brief because it kind of shows it. It's very striking. So not only, I mean, wages have impacted workers, you know, both men and women dramatically. They dipped dramatically in April. But when you break it down by worker type, so it's the entry level positions, the helper positions, and the sort of, I think, the line operator. Those are the two entry level positions. Those wages are extremely low. I mean, compared to the other positions, you know, certainly like supervisors are going to get paid more. And in just in our survey, I think 82% of those, you know, in those positions were women. So these are primarily jobs that females hold, and this is where the pay is really low. And this brings, I think, you know, issues around, I mean, just thinking about sort of, you know, programmatic activities or other things to do in the future. I mean, there's really a need for sort of mobility within the factories, that women sort of get stuck in
Mhm.
these entry level positions, and it's
They never
very, very
promote you
hard.
to supervisors.
Very hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very hard for them to move up. And I know I mean, there's been a little bit done on this. There's been some research on this, and there's been some programmatic interventions around this. But I think there needs to be a lot more, because I think what we're seeing is that, I mean, this kind of puts women, just even not even thinking about COVID, I mean, in general, in just to this sort of cycle of poverty that they can't get out of. And then on top of that, they have other, you know, all the responsibilities at home. They're primarily tasked with, you know, feeding their kids and figuring out what to, you know, how the kids will go to school, the healthcare, all the family issues. One thing I was very surprised in Bangladesh, I was talking to a labor leader who actually said the percentage of single mothers
Mm.
has dramatically risen. I didn't realize that. It's quite high. So in a society like Bangladesh and other countries, I mean, that also adds, not to mention the social stigma and everything else. I mean, there's not a lot of support for single women. So if they are, you know, they don't have a husband and they are paid at the lowest possible wages, I mean, you can imagine the kind of, what, you know, they are trapped in this cycle and they can't really get out of it. And COVID has again made that even worse.
Yeah. You know, our community is very quick to get to solutions and they're already saying, what can we do? But I did want to stick a little bit here to get you and Mark's sort of this intersectionality and connection between brand behavior and what that means to workers. So we've got the price squeeze, right? And that price squeeze and payment delay means that disproportionately women who are on the factory floor are increasingly vulnerable. There's hunger, there is malnutrition. But I also wonder if you can tie for me, we're seeing an uptick of gender-based violence. Rana Plaza was very much a physical health and safety manifestation of industry practices. But one of the things we don't often hear of as much is mental health. And so knowing that gender-based violence is up, mentally women are not faring as well. And tying that to how this is really connected to brands purchasing practices. I wonder if you can make that connection for our audience.
For me,
Yeah,
yeah,
both of
yeah,
you jump right in.
great. Yeah, no, this, I've done field research in different countries, and the one where I really sort of looked at that was in India. So I spent a bunch of time there, and this is the story that emerges. So now, you see that graph that we've done the price squeeze, right? So the question is, how do you stay in business then, right? And one is you either you just break even, or we also know, and Sanchita said very eloquently, these problems have existed for such a long time. We know prior to COVID, many suppliers during the year will take orders below cost because it's better to keep the factory going. You have to pay the bills. That even if you're below cost, the ILO is documented. The same as many as a third will have orders during the course of a year below cost, so that they'll produce that below. But the other answer is this: how do you stay in business if they say we're coming down in the price point, but your electricity costs might have gone up, the fabric costs might have gone up, and so on, and maybe the country even pushed up the minimum wage? How do you stay in business? And the answer is by increasing the hourly production quota. And so in India, I was able to document this. They were going from 60 operations per hour to 80 operations to even 100. The survey I did, 20% of workers said they had gotten up to 100 operations per hour. And I was doing research in different parts of the country, and of course, with different languages. So I'd have different interpreters helping me, but I would try to listen. And one point, what I was hearing the workers say, I thought she had misspoken. She said production torture, and we were talking about production targets. And I asked the interpreter, I said, did she say production torture? She said, yes. So what's that? And the workers talk to each other that way. What's your production torture? I'm up to 75 operations per hour. And the other one, no, that's nothing. We're up to 82 operations. My production torture is up to 82 operations. So now you've got this intense system of production. And in India, in some factories I found they would use tokens so you go to the bathroom. So the supervisor goes around every hour. If you didn't hit the quota, you don't get a token. You don't get a token. You can't go to the bathroom. So how does this link to what you're saying about gender-based violence at work? Well, it turns out in many of these factories, the supervisors are on contingent pay. Their pay is linked to the capacity of the workers on his or her line meeting quota. So if the workers are behind, that supervisor is going to lose income. So now the incentive system is structured in such a way that the supervisor gets crazy and wants those workers to work faster because it's in his or her financial interest. So they start yelling at the workers, work faster, and they yell at them. I put this in the report in very vulgar ways. It's not, why did you come here dressed so pretty if you can't work? You should be on a street corner. I mean, I ask the women, tell me what they're telling you. And then they'll grab the garments and throw it in their faces and tell them to work faster. So this is that decision, somebody sitting in a boardroom in New York City or San Francisco saying, you know what, this blue shirt, let's come down from $319 to $302 per item. Tell the suppliers in India they got to do it at $302 now. From that decision, some board member, all of a sudden you've got workers being hit, yelled at, and so on the factory floor. It's directly linked. This increase of gender-based violence at work is directly linked to purchasing practices that start at the top of supply chains.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with all of that. And I would just say, just to add to that, I mean, and this, we could talk for hours about this. I mean, it's the overall sort of misogyny that exists, certainly not in just in the global South, everywhere. And so the feeling of that women, can be used in this way, can be worked to death, literally, not taking into account their physical or mental or even basic needs. And the fact that it can go on, there's also a very weird gender dynamic in most of these factories. As we said, most of the entry level, many of the jobs bulk are still women. The supervisors are typically men. And so you get this, that's, you know, gender discrepancy in the factories. And you know, it's a larger issue around, you know, again, just misogyny that allows this to happen. The other interesting thing, I mean, interesting in a terrible way, and I'm sort of starting to look at this a little bit now, you know, it's interesting. I mean, a country like Bangladesh, for example, on one hand, I mean, the way the government or way other people will talk about it, well, you know, it's become a middle income country thanks to the garment industry. You know, we've uplifted women and they're empowered. And, you know, there's a certain sort of dynamic and sort of dialogue around that. Yet individual women are treated extremely badly in the garment sector. And, you know, there's a term in Bangla, which is called garmented me, which means garment girls, which is a very derogatory term. You're just a garment girl. You're never going to be like a proper woman or like a true woman. You know, so this kind of duality, you know, they are trying to do, they're literally working themselves to death for the betterment of the country, to bring it up to a certain level of growth. Yet individually, they don't receive any help, any support. And on top of that, in many of these societies, at least the countries that I've worked in, there's a very much of a way that they're looked down upon. So all of these, I think, play into the gender-based violence and the incredible sort of physical and mental torture is actually the right word.
And obviously we've seen a lot of this exasperated in COVID, right? Because you're talking about compressed delivery schedules, longer work hours. And if you can't even go to the bathroom, how can you wash hands? And you don't have access to COVID testing. And suddenly you're making product, you know, that is not really PPE, but it's, you know, tops and bottoms. And if you were to get sick, there's no safety nets to fall back on. But, you know, we are really have always been a community of hope. And so very quickly, as we were painting this picture for our community, people are like, well, what can we do? What can we do as conscious consumers? What can we do as young professionals in the fashion industry? So given your long history of working as activists and in academia, what do you think really needs to happen from a solution standpoint, especially, you know, now in the short term while we're in this crisis, but also thinking in the long term, since so much of the industry is already talking about building back better? If we were to truly do that, what do you think we need to do from a solution standpoint? And maybe Mark, we'll start with you and then Sanchita come to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, this is the crucial question. And I like, Aisha, how you broke it into time frame, because I think it's helpful. Otherwise, we'll go a little crazy trying to figure out where do we start with this. So I think short, maybe medium, then long term, but certainly short and long term. Short term, one is for all of you, continue doing what you're doing. The PayUp campaign, there's still, you know, roughly 18 billion hasn't been paid up. Anyone that hasn't paid up has to pay up. Secondly, these new campaigns that you're launching are just so crucial. You know, wage assurances, severance guarantees, now a new campaign for living wages. The research you're all doing showing how these companies have returned to profitability. Returning to profitability, you know, not incidentally by squeezing down on price for these desperate suppliers. I mean, and keeping the prices for the consumer the same. So all those things I think are so crucial. Social protection. This industry has gotten away largely without paying taxes. And then what do you do in a country like Bangladesh or India when you have decades of no tax revenue? How do you support your workers? There's no social net there to fall back on. So I think in the short term, that's really crucial. I think in purchasing practices going forward, we have to get to a model of total costing for decent work. The price point has to be right, and this has to be supervised by a binding co-governed agreement. And lastly, I think this was mentioned in chat, long term, we have to rethink the development model. And, you know, sometimes we have these separate conversations and people and planet, and some people are talking about the planet and have the environmental and the dump truck every second dumping garment. And the others were focused on workers. How do we bring this together? Because the question becomes, if all this is sort of suggesting we need to consume less, well, what does that mean for workers' jobs? We can't just then abandon the workers as we sort of all buy secondhand clothing. So the question then becomes, how do we connect these two? And my little dream scenario of all of this, if you actually get into what's going on at work and things that Sanchita's also been talking about, this question of long hours of work and work intensity, just imagine, just sort of dream for a bit, what would it be like if you had a humane pace of production, taking it from that 100 operations per hour back to 60 or 50, a humane pace of production? And what would it be like if we had a world where you're actually going to have an 8-hour workday 5 days a week and have a proper weekend? If you did that, you would dramatically reduce this output. You would have a humane pace of production, a humane work week, and you could do it with the same number of workers. And at the other side, we could have less consumption, which means we would have to pay more per garment. It just comes down to that, but it's okay, if you bear with me, because we're buying less. We don't need to buy 85, as we are now, items of apparel per US citizen, in this case, American, of every year. So bringing down our consumption, paying a bit more for better quality goods, helping that to pay living wages, and bringing down that work week and those production quotas. We can do this in the long term.
Thank you, Mark. I'm so glad that you pointed to this dichotomy, because, you know, often we will get this question as, I'm trying to be a conscious consumer, but if I buy less or if I buy secondhand, aren't I hurting the very women I'm professing to help? And, you know, certainly the H&M CEO didn't help this matter when he talked about, oh, the naivete of these young people trying to say they want to boycott H&M. Well, guess what? We create a lot of jobs. But to your point, these are not humane jobs. These are not livable jobs. And certainly our planet cannot sustain the volume of production. So if we talked about humane production and living wages, then we would automatically be paying not disposable prices for our clothes today, which are, the exploitation is reflected in the price tag. So turning to you, Sanchita, in terms of, you know, immediately what needs to happen, and as we're talking about building back better, what do you think from a solution standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Mark has said. And I think, you know, I would also echo that. I mean, all the work that you all are doing is critical. As I said, you know, there's very little incentive for global brands to dramatically change the system under which they work. You know, it works for them. So there's not a lot of incentive. But what does work, and I've talked to brands who have said, you know, off the record, that no one wants to be on the, you know, the end of a campaign like this. And that's really something important to realize, that your work is impactful. They don't, whether, you know, I think we're way past that time when we're going to say, you know, for altruism or for ethics, you're going to do this. No, it's what's going to, you know, hurt the brand. Yeah, they're going to care about their brand reputation. And if you're bringing it out there for the world to see. There was so much international coverage around, you know, the brand cancellations, thanks to Mark's work and thanks to all of your activism. You know, that's really critical. And I think we have to realize that that's what's going to impact brands. The other thing I wanted to say is we also have to realize, I mean, supply chain is complicated, right? So it's not just the brands. Brands are key. I mean, we certainly have to look at their decision making, but let's not forget, they're in many of these countries, the owners of these factories, they also have their own incentives. They struggle, yes, but many of them are also the extreme elite in the society. They have, you know, really nice houses. They make quite a bit of money, and they're often hesitant to, you know, have it all trickle down to the workers. So not to say, I mean, there are good owners, there are bad owners, you know, it's a mix. But we have to remember that, I mean, there are multiple layers, and it's not just sort of one layer we need to look at. So, you know, I was listening to an activist on a webinar the other day. I mean, she said, you know, we can push the brands so much. Yes, you know, you have to pay better prices and stuff, but we can't say, okay, come to our country and set up a system of social welfare. Like, that's not their job. It's our government needs to do that. The owners need to do that. I've heard from activists say that, you know, there were individual owners who wanted to pay their workers more. They wanted to give actually a lot of the benefits, and without naming names, but large, private sector organizations really clamped down on that. They did not allow that. So there's, it's complicated as with anything. And then to get down to the worker level, I've worked a lot with women workers. Many of them will say, I mean, the union structure is really flawed in a lot of these countries. They're very patriarchal. They're very political. Men tend to take over, and female workers don't get a voice. So that even at that level, okay, how do we think of organizing? That has been a real problem over the years. Even though, I mean, there's been some encouraging signs, but it's not always the number of unions registered. That's not a good measure. Unions mean very different things in these countries. It can be, how are workers, but particularly women workers, how are they going to be heard? Oftentimes we have things at the factory level, like workers committees, safety committees. I mean, they serve a purpose, but they are often seen as a way to justify crackdowns on unions. And that's another aspect that we didn't talk about that's been happening under COVID. There's severe crackdowns on organizing. And, that's kind of the other thing. So I just wanted to sort of bring up, I mean, at every layer, there are things, it's so complex. I mean, it's, like I said, I've been working on this for 16 years. I still don't have my head around it
I mean, in many
completely.
ways, we are trying to grapple the twin evil of capitalism and misogyny, and within the microcosm of the fashion industry.
Right.
It's the way it's set up. And I think it's really important what you said, Sanchita, about suppliers are also not these poor hurting. I think in some ways that
Yeah.
for labor organizers and activists like ourselves, it was an unlikely partnership during COVID to join up to demand orders are paid because they were treated so badly and we need
Absolutely. Yeah.
orders paid. But what we do know, and having grown up in Pakistan and seen the factory owners are often the elite, to your point,
Yeah.
and the union bosses who are often men can also be elite, but at the end of the day, it's done through the labor of women.
Yeah.
If I
Absolutely.
were to synthesize what you all are saying, someone here in the chat said, what can I do as a conscious consumer? And, time and time again, we at Remake really like to talk about we are citizens first and consumers second, that the thing that was most powerful was the energy that we all put towards demanding that brands pay up. And that's where, Mark, even in your data, you were able to see of the 40 billion of stolen money, 22 billion that was recovered was through the relentless campaigning. So in the short term, it's all about that campaigning. People are still not safe. Women are still not being paid. Hence, it's really important the Share Your Profits campaign around we need severance, we need wages paid. But building back better, if I were to summarize, it's like, well, it's about wages. But if we talk about wages, we can't talk about it without also talking about hours. So the only way to do this is to be really pushing brands to be creating livable wages and humane production, rewarding the brands that do better, as we do through our transparency index of buy with these who pay living wages, and boycotting the ones that are simply not holding that contract. We have a global community here, so it sounds like working with union leaders, promoting women into supervisory positions, putting them into positions of power, and thinking about unions as a way to shore up labor rights is important. Right here in California, we've got Senate Bill 62, which is what we were focused on for our January call, and that is holding accountability not just for brands, but also manufacturers. So again, for our community to understand that that's really a way to create long-term change. We're not going to buy our way into sustainable fashion future, but it'll only be with good regulatory reform. So I'm now moving to Q&A for the last 10 minutes here. I see it's been a very animated chat. If you'd like to raise your hand, introduce yourselves to our wonderful guests and ask your question yourself, that would be very welcome. If you prefer to put it in the chat box, that's great too. One of the things that there was a question earlier here that Wendy had asked was what either of you think about the mandatory human rights due diligence that's being a topic of conversation within the European Union. Do you think that's going to make us progress towards a better future? Just thoughts on that. Mark, did you want to weigh in first, perhaps?
Or Sanchita, do you have thoughts on that either?
Yeah, I mean, I think these, you know, So until and something is binding, I think that's what we've realized. The voluntary, even doing it for the sake of it's the right thing to do, the ethical thing to do. I mean, we've had the UN has had these standards, which I think are very important. I mean, I don't want to dismiss them, and it's a framework and it's important. But I think what we've realized is, I mean, things, if they're not binding, if they don't have teeth, it's and they're not enforceable, then the reality is they don't really work. I mean, or work in the long term. They may work, I mean, if you think about a lot of the CSR, the corporate social responsibility that's taken place over the last several decades, I mean, for the most part, I think they've been, I hate to sort of say, but I think they've sort of been band-aids,
Rubbish, you can say it.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't really, they put money into these things, but for the most part, they haven't made, serious impact, and they've kind of been band-aids, and they're not, they're sort of on the side. CSR people kind of have their own thing, and they're not really working with, everyone else in the company. So, I mean, I think the larger question is, is it something enforceable? What kind of legal enforceability is there? That would be sort of my criteria.
Just to add to it too, I think that's absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. The other piece I would say too is, there's a role for sort of top-down solutions, a state coming in and mandatory due diligence, France or Germany, different, and that even when it's binding. But I think what I also see for sustainable solutions are solutions that are bottom up, that encourage empowerment. When I first did my first kind of research on CSR, I did this piece between legitimacy and control. And my conclusion was, at the time, these top-down initiatives were looking at child labor, forced labor in a paternalistic way. Let's have mandates from the top, but we control the process the entire time. When it was about voice and empowerment and worker organizing, all of a sudden they looked the other way. They didn't really want to monitor that and ensure voice, with all the limitation that Sanchita mentioned. I just want to, my research in India, I just want to mention there's a really dynamic group in Bangalore in the South called GLUE, which is all women led. They formed their own union. Men are in the organization, but the leadership by mandate, it's led by women, and they're really doing some very impressive work. So there's models out there too. So I think we've got to, sometimes I think one thing we could do well is get in and empower these women, protect them. It has to be protected voice. It can't be a worker management committee where you could be fired at any time. It has to be a properly, legally protected organization. Boy, oh boy, would that go a long way to changing things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If I could just briefly add, I mean, in terms of, I know it's been a very, we brought up the really negative and the dismal side. I mean, from my experience working for, say, 15, 16 years, what I have seen is extremely hopeful. And I give the example all the time, mainly in Bangladesh, but in other countries as well. The female-led movements, not necessarily unions, they're just sort of activist groups, informal movements. I mean, I know Remake has worked with many of them. Incredible, these women, what they've done and what they've been able to achieve. And ironically, I mean, some of the comparative work I did earlier, kind of showed, I mean, Bangladesh is a country where, I mean, we sort of think things are sort of hopeless in many ways, but the activism among women is actually very strong. Whereas other countries, actually, say Sri Lanka, Cambodia, they're sort of slightly better of labor rights, or they have been in the past comparatively, but you see a lot more repression on actually, female organizing. You don't see the kinds of, it is happening, but it's not in the same dynamic way you see in Bangladesh. And so I think that there is a hopeful story there, when women are empowered, when women do take a stand, the kinds of things that they work on, these things like maternity benefits, childcare, all of that came really from women leaders. I don't think anyone else deserves credit for any of that other than the women leaders who push those. Because also, if you think about it, I mean, male union worker leaders will never advocate for maternity leave. There's very specific things that women will advocate for.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, I think one of the things that both of you have said here is so important around the time for voluntary efforts is over. Here we are 20 years later, all the codes of conduct, all the human rights frameworks, UN, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, the only times we've made progress has been when it's a binding agreement, much like the Accord was a binding agreement. And so we had to hold brands to account. But also that the girl power, and this is something we certainly see in Remake when we are, in the communities and in the production hubs, the fierce feminists who are fighting for their rights. And in many ways, it is this colonial mindset about rescuing her, and it's top down, where any of the inroads we've actually made are bottom up. So I thank you both so much for those important points. Wendy here is waiting very patiently with her hand up. Go ahead, Wendy, with your question. If you don't mind telling everyone where you're calling in from today.
Yeah, I will try to be brief, even though I have, I know I've been working in this industry for about 20 years, a lot from the development side, but a lot coming from the child labor, working on the child labor, and I worked the Department of Labor previously. But Mark and Sanchita, thank you so much for your work and for being here. And Mark, I've taken a couple of your online classes also, just very, very, very good, very well done. But I come from, I understand your paternalistic kind of the view you were talking about for child labor. And I absolutely agree. Over the last years, I've really come to think in the development sector, you need to include unions and worker voices much more than they're separate. They're not included. And I also agree, really the voices I'm all for the mandatory due diligence. I've been following the Europe structure very much, and I see like your governments see that things haven't worked, so now we have to make it mandatory. How they're going to actually be implemented and how it will work, I do think it also has to come from the ground up, like you say. And but I think it takes a lot of development work. I mean, I agree, like you were saying, Sanchita, like the women, the breastfeeding centers, some of these things, the childcare centers on site, all of these, but I'll also behavior,
because we have three anxious.
Oh yeah, no, I guess
I have to wrap up too. So your question.
You're right. I mean, I think I mean, I guess it would be really interesting that, what we could realistically hope for, I guess, what we really hope for from the company side. I mean, I still have a lot of fear. I still really fear with the with the shrinkage of the squeeze and the shrinkage of the production over the years. Like how can we really I know you made some suggestions, but I still fear, are there other things that we can be doing for these women and these workers to prepare for the future? Are we thinking?
Okay,
so I'm going to ask that side.
And we're going to do a rapid round because we're running out of time. And if people want to stay on for 5 more minutes, I know there's a lot of questions here, but Wendy's question is, the industry is going to consolidate, it's going to shrink. Are there any other ideas of how we can be protecting this workforce beyond what's already been said? Sanchita?
Oh, yeah, no, I think we've kind of said, I mean, I would say, the work that you're doing, which you support local movements, and that's, I think, key. But I think
supporting local movements, that's super. And there's another question here around, do you know of any female-led, worker-led activist organizations in Bangladesh?
Yeah, I'm happy to send you.
Okay, so if you could put that in the chat, one of our partners I'll point everyone to is Awaj Foundation.
Yeah, they're fantastic.
There's been an incredible ally for us in the PayUp work. She's one of the writers of the PayUp Fashion site and demanding what needs to happen. But any others, Sanchita, we'd love in the chat. I'm going to turn it over to a question Tanya has. Tanya has been doing this work as an influencer and a blogger for many, many years and is a wonderful member of our community. Go ahead, Tanya.
Hi guys.
There's a lag. I don't think you have great video. So Tanya, if you don't mind typing in your question, because there's a lag and it's hard to hear you. Okay, we have a few more participants. Sharada, go ahead with your question, and Tanya, I'll come back to you if your internet stabilizes. Sharada? You have to unmute him.
Hi, this is Shraddha from India.
Go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Yeah. So Mark has been talking about Indian scenario. So I'm a lawyer, basically. I've recently graduated from law school. So when he was talking, So India is a big labor market when it comes to garment industry. However, recently Indian government has been passing a lot of laws around labor, and one of such is they are gonna implement code, factories code. They are gonna amend it where they are gonna make working hours from 8 hours to 12 hours. I just wanted to know, when we want to make industry whole sustainable, government plays a big role in it. So do you think it's a free pass for the brands to exploit labor if Indian government implement this law? What, I just wanted to know your thoughts about it.
Now, yes, the great question. Do you want me to, I mean, I don't know for time to take several, go jump in on this one. Yeah.
Yes, that'd be wonderful.
Well, I mean, this is the crucial problem at the end of the day. You know, we get into this chicken and the egg. Where do we start? And brands say, well, the governments have to improve their laws and their enforcement, and governments see themselves competing with other countries, and their pressure is to lessen the labor laws, either, you know, de facto, you say, or it actually de jure. I mean, either they actually, like India is doing, lowering the laws. We have to, in Bangladesh, the knit manufacturers are saying, don't implement the 5% increase, which is by law. It's 16 cents a day that these workers are entitled to by law. And they're saying the competition is such, we can't afford it. This is absurd, but how do you get out of this, right? The ILO has this nice language going back over 100 years, you know, basically any country that violates is a threat to all countries that want to improve. So somehow we have to come through that this is unacceptable. There has to be adverse consequences for countries that push downward on their labor standards, not the benefits of greater production orders. But it's easier said than done. I mean, something we need to watch too is this sort of the reactivation of the STAR network, where the supplier countries are starting to talk about coordinating the purchasing practices. Now, the idea is that you've got to do it in such a way, as Sanchita says, this isn't just a plan to help the elite in the country. How do you do that? And I think if they were smart, they would, this is a network, China, India, Bangladesh, you know, all the major Asian garment exporters joining together to discuss better purchasing practices. I think labor should be involved in those discussions, so it's done in such a way that it doesn't just benefit them, but the benefits go down to the workers as well. And they'd be politically much more powerful if they had a STAR network, producers and labor together making demands to the brands. So.
And if I can add just very quickly, I mean, you know, this is how the ugly side of capitalism, how it rears its head. I mean, in Ethiopia, when just a few years ago, when they trying to be the rising star of Africa, they basically negotiated that there would not be a minimum wage. So you can't even imagine that, right? I mean, there's no minimum wage. That's how they attract.
Got all the awards with PVH and these others.
Yeah. But ultimately, I mean, it's a horrible situation what's happening in Ethiopia. But, you know, I mean, that's the fact that, like, how much the competition works, that you are actually able to, you know, present your case to these various buyers by saying, we don't have a minimum wage. That's how you're attracting them. And that's how you're getting business. That shouldn't be allowed inside, you know, but it is.
I mean,
I think it's a campaign which India has been running to Make in India. It's a part of Make in India campaign to just attract suppliers. And I totally agree with what Mark said. We need to give people the place at the table whom you're making law about. If you don't hear from the people, you would never know what's the problem, where the problem is, and how you can solve it.
Thank you, Shraddha. I think it's absolutely right that, you know, for us, I think as discerning in our own communities, it's about, if you're not talking about labor rights, you're not talking about wages, you don't have labor at the table, then essentially it's a government campaign to capture order volume, really at the expense of workers. Tanya, who was trying to ask a question, and I apologize, we're running a little over, so I'm going to take one more question and then wrap up. She's having some Wi-Fi troubles. She said she's an H&M ambassador and was wondering if you had any advice as she were to take advice back to H&M in terms of what are some of the efforts and initiatives they should be working on, especially if they want to make actionable change.
I'll just say one thing only because I recently heard it, and this is not comprehensive. But one of the issues is I think some activists, again, you all are in touch with them, maybe many on the ground. Sometimes the issue becomes, the money is not trickling down to the workers. And I've heard this in a few different ways. So specifically H&M, why I can say that, because that was mentioned. So they have, I guess, other funds, different, sort of foundations, other ways they were trying to help the workers during this time. And according to some activists on the ground, that money was not actually seen. Now, where it goes, I don't know. It could be going into various things, if they're paying consultants or paying, but I think that's a kind of an important issue to think about, that how, does the money actually get to the workers who need them? Whether it's, by the time it's going down, even the government stimulus in Bangladesh, I mean, some people said, well, it never really made it, or it made it to some of the owners. Some didn't even pay the workers. Some did, it's all of these things. It's, it, the transparency behind the money, the whatever monies that are going in and actually getting there. Now, what is the solution? I don't know. I mean, some follow-up needs to happen, like when foundations or when companies and brands, trying to do the right thing, trying to give more, in terms of money, is it actually getting to the workers? I think that's kind of a piece I'm still kind of wondering about, and what to do about that.
Wonderful.
Just to jump into, I know we're but quickly too, I couldn't agree more with Sanchita. And just to say, I think Elizabeth Klein put in some of these 3 different initiatives. H&M has the power. If it moves on these issues, others will follow. And to directly what Sanchita is saying, here are different than these voluntary initiatives, contribute or make a donation or something like this was philanthropy. Different from that, there are several very concrete agreements that are binding clauses about these paying wage assurances and severance pay and so on, and now a new living wage campaign. Take that back, please take that back to H&M and get them to sign on to these initiatives. It'll matter not only for workers in H&M supply chain, but again, others, will likely, the history tells us, will follow suit. And that would be such an enormous, impulse to this effort. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, Sanchita and Mark, you both are absolutely incredible. I see from all the raised hands, our community keeps wanting to ask you questions, but I want to be mindful of time and know you have classes to teach. So I just wanted to close us out here on a high note, and really just ask you this question of, given all the work that you see, given how sometimes it feels like we're not making much progress in the fashion industry, how do you personally stay inspired and hopeful?
Do I either? I'll be short. By having contact with people like you and seeing the great work you're doing, and workers inspire me. I'm now, it's been, the last trip I made was in February. I was in Guatemala, talking with workers out on the banana plantations, hearing their stories and hearing their inspiration to me. But the problems they have, the challenges they face every day when they get up, when they form their organizations, they do their efforts, they have successes, and they achieve their sense of empowerment. That's so incredibly inspiring. I believe very strongly in the positive aspect of human nature. I think if we can get the stories out there, if we can mobilize, we can articulate our demands in a very clear way, changes we all want are within our grasp. And I think this 22 billion that was achieved is a sign that there's so much that we can do when we coordinate. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in any situation, there are always good people, and you'll always find them, whether it's in the corporate world, whether they are suppliers. I've talked to those who have risked their careers trying to do the right thing. I've talked to suppliers who've gone, out of their way to support their workers. Those things inspire me, because I mean, it's not just about, we're not trying to villainize one group over the other. The reality is we all have to work together, and it's all ultimately individual people who are going to make it happen, whether in, whatever structure they are a part of. So when we connect as individuals, and when we try to work together to do what is ethically right and, the right thing, it does happen. And sometimes, I mean, I just want to also say, I think we're all impatient. We want to see change immediately, and it's frustrating when you don't see it. But if you take a long-term view, there has been change in this sector, and it's quite remarkable over the last couple decades, which 20 years ago we wouldn't have these kind of conversations. Brands were not aware, suppliers were not aware, there wasn't this much activism. I mean, things have changed, and they are changing. And so I would just say all of you to kind of keep up your great work, and be positive. This is a great example of what you are able to achieve when you come together collectively.
Wonderful, Mark and Sanchita. I wish that we were physically together so we could be clapping. I know people will do that on the screen. If you have words and compliments to share on the chat, please do that. As you see how we're desperately lingering on and hanging on to your words, our community appreciates your research, your authenticity with which you've been focused on this industry during the pandemic so very much. I want to thank you for your time. For everyone who is eager to connect with Mark and Sanchita, I will, in the recap of this call, include their research briefs so you're able to look at the data more. A couple of very quick announcements on our end. In the spirit of Mark saying, keep in good company. That's what keeps you hopeful. That's what keeps you galvanized. Sam has put in our Palentine Day mixer that we're having. It's really a way for us as activists to know one another in the community. You're welcome to bring a change maker, a friend of your choice, to that mixer. So please do join us. And, as Mark and Sanchita have galvanized us, change takes time. But it is us as citizens that have managed to do so very much in this last year. And so let's keep going. And to that end, Katrina has put in our new Share Your Profit campaign assets in the chat. We'll include them in the notes as well. One of the things we know as we're walking into February is that brands have done quite well. They have made millions, if not billions, in pandemic profit. We have the data, we have the ready to go Instagram and other assets for them to say, it's time now for you to be paying workers, to be paying severance. You cannot hide behind the fact that somehow you're not making money. So let's keep going. Please do thank our guests, and I look forward to our March call. Thank you for your wonderful questions, and more soon. Happy Monday, everyone.